The Iron Game Chalk Talk podcast is brought to you by the following sponsors: EliteForm.com, IgnitionAPG.com, PlayUSA at PLAEUSA.com, and Sorinex Exercise Equipment at Sorinex.com. And now, the Iron Game Chalk Talk podcast. Welcome to Iron Game Chalk Talk with your host, Ron McKeefery.
Every time our athletes walk into this weight room, they're going to be pushed to the max.
Let's go! Everything you got!
On this podcast, hear Coach McKeefery straight talk about training, featuring the top strength and conditioning professionals from around the world. And now, here's your host, Ron McKeefery.
Hey guys, welcome back to Iron Game Chalk Talk. I'm your host, Ron McKeefery, and this is episode number 168. Super excited to bring you Lachlan Wilmot today. Lachlan is the head strength and power coach for the Greater Western Sydney Giants down in Australia. I've gotten a chance to know him just from afar, and he's one of the top strength coaches out there, doing great things. Him and David Joyce down there. And I wanted to have him on the show. I wanted to get into, obviously a lot of the things that we normally talk about, his journey and the mistakes he's made, but I really wanted to dive into Australian Rules Football League and just really kind of what's the difference between that, rugby, rugby union, rugby sevens, and talk a little bit about the different types of programming that goes along with that, how he's able to individualize his programs, how he's able to educate the team on all the travel they do and different testing that they do and things along those lines. So I got a ton out of this episode. I know that you're going to too. Before we do, we want to make sure we recognize our sponsor for this episode, Elite Form. If you have not started following them on Facebook, make sure you do so. You can go to at Elite Form Sports Science on Facebook, Twitter. I believe they're on Instagram as well. But just up at Rob Taylor's place in Baltimore, Maryland, speaking at his conference, they're outfitted with Elite Form, and it was a hit with everybody that attended the conference and how they're using it and just some creative ways. But I would highly recommend you if you're looking for a way of measuring velocity. Again, where a lot of people drop off is where Elite Form starts, and the technology is far advanced. And it's not even tapping into what's possible with Elite Form yet. So I would encourage you to check them out. Great guy, Skip Cronin and the rest of the gang there. I've had Skip on the show. You guys have heard that. If you haven't, go back and listen to that episode. I believe it was 164. And, again, they're just pioneers. They're guys that are pushing the envelope each and every day. They got some great products besides just the Power Tracker. And if you're in the market, I would definitely reach out and check them out. If not, follow them on social media. They're going into a lot of crate facilities around the world. I know they're going to be down in Australia with me at the AIS-AFL conference in November. Super excited about that, going down there for that. And if you're going to be there, please let me know. Please let me reach out ahead of time so I can make sure to catch up with you while being down there on the other side of the world and just spending some time with everybody. So I want to get to this episode. I know you're going to enjoy it. Sit back, and we'll see you on the other side. All right, guys, welcome back to Iron Game Chalk Talk. Excited to have Lachlan Wilmot with us. Lachlan is the strength coach for the West Sydney Giants AFL down in Sydney, Australia, and just a guy that I followed from afar, and him and a good friend, David Joyce, and just doing some phenomenal things down there. So, man, I appreciate you coming on the show. You woke up early for us, 6 a.m. down there. And,
thanks, Ron. Appreciate it, mate. No, yeah, it's nice and early. Sun's not up yet, but that's all good.
I appreciate you doing it, brother. Hey, go into your journey a little bit. Give us a Reader's Digest version of how you ended up there with the West Sydney Giants.
Yeah, definitely. It's obviously, I think, a little bit of a different approach to what a lot of people have, considering we are a startup club. So our club 5 years ago was basically brought out of nothing, created in Sydney. For those people that don't really know Australian football, Sydney by nature is not an AFL stronghold. It is much more rugby league. So the AFL endeavoured to try and build a few more teams in Sydney. So we've got one, the Sydney Swans, and then us. So prior to that, I was actually working working with the AFL New South Wales ACT team, which is basically as a state coordinator working around a massive state, really. Like, we've had a lot of boys from the country, 8-9 hour drives away. So I was trying to coordinate both city people, country boys, and basically trying to build a bit of a representative team out of that.
Sure.
And then from that, we also worked with the AIS. So a lot of people are fairly familiar with the AIS in Australia, the Australian Institute of Sport.
Yep.
So they had an under-17 squad, which was termed their All-Australian squad. So there was 30 boys in that were selected, which were effectively pre-draft age. So 30 the best in the country. The year before they get drafted, they're brought into a development squad, and I worked as the assistant strength coach with that. So that was sort of a lot of the development around that youth side, and then. It was basically announced they were looking at bringing in a Western Sydney team. The first employee of Greater Western Sydney, which is the team I work for now, was actually the head coach at the AIS at the time. So he contacted me and said, "I want you to come on board as a strength coach in the early days." And mate, we were just a development squad then, young. Didn't know too much about what was going forward and where we were going to go or what we were going to even be called. And started there with an under-18 squad, and it slowly evolved year after year, and that was in 2010 now. So what are we, 2016? So yeah. It's slowly built up, and our department, or our athletic performance unit, has developed since then. When I started, it was me. The next year, we brought on a high-performance manager, so there was two of us. Then the next year, we brought on GPS. Next year, we brought on data. Next year, we brought on an assistant, some rehab, and before you know it, we've got a fully fledged APU department, mate. So it's been an almost dream progression each year, this slow build, and definitely something that I think a lot of people don't get exposed to. They're either build their credentials in amateurs, and especially in Australia, you sort of get thrown into professional. There's definitely not that college aspect where you can do your undergrad, intern while you're doing your undergrad. Right. Then you can do, your GA position, and then you go into an assistant role, and then a head role, and there's this almost dream progression. Right. I was exposed to that, luckily, but in Australia, it's very much work 4 different amateur jobs. And then if you're lucky enough, boom, you get into the professional league. So that middle ground is definitely something that's lacking from Australia, simply because our universities are nowhere near the size of a college or anything like that. So university sport isn't the size of a university sport over there in the States.
Sure. Mm. Well, there's lots to pull out of there. First let's just talk difference, just for everybody that's from this side of the ocean there. What's the difference between rugby union, rugby league, and Australian rules, Australian football?
Yeah, perfect. Having been to the States a few times is one of the biggest mistakes I think a lot of people make. So rugby league, rugby union are very similar in look. So rugby union is your typical New Zealand All Blacks. Okay. So international code. So we have the Wallabies, which is international. And rugby union in Australia is much more that seen as a private school style game when it comes to high school. That's where they feed a lot of teams from. So you have your private school boys. They'll play rugby union in high school, build up, and get pushed into the leagues that way. Rugby league is the best way to describe it is it's a form of rugby. It's the same as rugby union, the fact that there's 2 lines going at each other. But for those who follow league and union, they both know there's some big differences. But it looks very similar. A lot of tackling, very similar tackling. It's just rugby union is probably more flowing in the fact that you don't have a certain number of tackles. It's just you get tackled to the ground, you put the ball behind you, the scrum continues on, and it's this build or evolution of play. AFL is then the most different. So AFL is played on a cricket field sized ground, so quite a large ground. It's 18 or 22 men are listed, but 18 take the field. And it is very much like soccer, like there's a 360-degree position of it. It's not 2 lines going head-on with each other, but there's no offside. You can hand pass it and kick it, so you can use both hands and feet. It's very fast, very free-flowing, and a lot of people describe it like a seagull chasing a chip. So it's basically 4 quarters. They end up going for about half an hour, so it's about a 2-hour game, and it's just non-stop running, tackling, jumping. It's everything you could dream sport could be, mate.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's great. So now with union and league, they both go 7s and 15 or
No. Just so rugby union is at sevens, which is the Olympic sport.
Right.
Rugby league have just started to do a pre-season competition, which is called the nines. So they do a nine-a-side small one, but it's that's just in its infancy, and it's more about pre-season for them. Whereas the rugby sevens is almost a different athlete.
Yeah.
You find the rugby sevens boys, in fact, are probably closer to an AFL style athlete in the fact they need to be able to run a little bit more.
Right.
But they're such short games that's more on that anaerobic side rather than the aerobic side. But they usually are somewhat leaner athletes and tend to be lightning fast.
And those AFL athlete, you're saying that there's 18 from each team on the field at one time?
Correct. So 22 get listed for that game. 4 will be on the bench, 18 on the field.
Wow.
So it's 18 v 18 on the field, and it's probably the rotations are more like ice hockey, where the bench is more a position. You don't get benched for doing something wrong. Our midfielders, which are our running athletes, they'll come on. They'll maybe do anywhere between 8 to 12-minute stint, and then they come off 3 minutes, 5 minutes, reset, and then go back on, just because the running loads are so much. Previous to this year, there wasn't much of a cap on rotations, which means it was very free-flowing. Now they've capped it at 90 rotations. So to give you an idea, a few years ago, a lot of teams were doing about 156 rotations.
Wow.
So they've brought that down to 90, which does make the game a little bit different in the fact our boys need to have that more aerobic base and be able to run a little bit longer because they don't get the joy of coming off for 2 to 3 minutes and going again.
Is it more like a shift change in hockey where they're running on and off, or is it more like a change in like volleyball where they're having to stop play?
No, it is free-flowing. So part of the art of AFL is picking the most appropriate time to come off and get on and move into position. And if you're a defender, when do you come off and leave your man free? Because the way it's laid out, it's almost in pairs. If you were to look as a bird's eye view, you'd have your forward line, midfield, and back line. And your opposition, their forwards match up on your backs.
Right.
Their midfielders match up on the midfielders. Their forward and our backs match up on their forwards. So it's very much, we play on each other. Obviously, sometimes we run off each other, but it's somewhat paired up when it comes to your opposition.
Right. Yeah, and that takes me into my next question. Actually, is as a strength and conditioning coach now, you're programming for different body types, different positions. Much like football, where you're going to have your line, your linebackers, your defensive backs. How have you individualized? How have you been able to take 22 guys, and I'm sure the team's probably made up of more than that. How have you been able to individualize programs and still maintain the room and maintain the structure and accountability that you're looking for?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a challenge. There's no doubt about that. I think my biggest philosophy is over-individualisation I stay away from, because I firmly believe they're still out there for the same amount of time. They still need to be strong. And when we inherit our boys, they are usually fresh out of high school. So they are allowed to be drafted at 17 and 9 months. So that's the youngest draftee that will come in. So a majority of our first years will be 18 years of age. So we don't have... in Australia, our high school system does not have a strength and conditioning program like a lot of US high schools have.
Right.
It is very much, if you played rugby, then you'd probably do weights. If you played AFL, you may do some sort of weights program, but as a general rule, most of the boys that come into us have done very little in their development. So when I get them, they're usually young, thin whippets, because by nature our sport is a running sport.
Right.
So our best players in youth tend to be able to be the best runners. Now that's not to say we don't get some ready-built boys in, but we tend to get boys that are very lean and haven't done a lot of weight training. So first part of individualisation is our first years are on a completely separate program to kick off, as most people's would be.
Right.
For us, it's about teaching them how to strength train, teaching them how to move, understanding where they're at, knowing that they're both taking on a weights program that may be anywhere between 3 and 5 times a week, and they're also now coming into a full-time sport. They've just been in high school. They've just finished high school, having had classes all day, topping up in the afternoons with their training, and suddenly they're thrown into a full-time setup where they are both on-field and doing weights, doing Pilates, doing what we call DPIT, but it's basically boxing, wrestling, tackling, all that type of stuff within one day. And our first years, they'll literally get home at 6 p.m. and they will go to sleep. And they'll sleep all the way through and get. It is a very tough year.
Yeah.
So from the strength point of view, we use their program to basically get them moving, teach them about strength training, introduce them to landing mechanics, basically have an overview and make sure they're ready to go and hit their second year. So they're effectively learning how to train.
Right.
But within our group, we have 43 on our list. So there's a few players, so it's effectively enough for 2 teams.
Right.
And we are mixed between your short boys that are very aerobic and very tough, and we also have our tall boys, which can get up to over 200 centimetres, and they're our rucks. So somewhat like basketball, how they have their centres that tap off in the beginning.
Right.
Our boys, same thing. That's how we start our game. The ball's thrown up, and we have our tallest 2 blokes go at it. So one of the biggest individualisations for us is actually limb length. So we find boys, whether it be squatting, deadlifting, it may be as little as changing the range of motion for them as their individualisation. It may be taking them to a completely different exercise. But we often find that some of our tall athletes in AFL, they're very athletic and can actually move very well. So we tend to try and give them as much as we can in regards to movements, but some of the biggest individualisations will be around how tall are you, what are your limb lengths, what is going to suit you. And it might be as simple as, instead of doing a deadlift from the floor, they'll do a trap bar deadlift.
Yeah.
So things like that. Obviously, basketball use trap bars quite a bit because of their length. And we're very similar. We'll utilise trap bar deadlifts quite a lot with our taller boys. The other comparison is our body weight, because we have boys that come into us at game weight. So unlike a lot of other footballs where they're looking to put on mass, with our boys running substantially large volumes, if they have too much mass, their running volume drops. And AFL midfielders are synonymous with being very sensitive about their weight. So we will tag boys as needing high exposure or low exposure. So if they're a high exposure boy, they will be our thin whippet style boys, and we know that we need to get volume into them. So we make sure we hit volume, try and put a little bit of size on them. If we have our midfielders that come in and they're more that, what we call an inside midfielder, so they get tackled a lot, they tackle a lot, they hit a lot, they've got to be a little bit more robust and a little bit bigger. They also naturally are a little bit bigger.
Right.
And they usually are those ones that if they weren't playing AFL, they could be more of a bodybuilding style. They're more that mesomorphic style look.
Right.
So we find that if we do give them too much volume, they bulk up very quickly. And that is actually a limiting factor for them for actually having their running capacity. So we're very cautious about picking which boys we're giving exposures to. And that's what I find the biggest thing in AFL is, if you've been in the system for 3 years and you're not at your weight for playing, you're not at your playing weight, then something's gone wrong.
Right.
Or you're one of the hardest gainers in the team.
Yeah.
And we do. We've got a couple of boys that it's almost impossible to put on weight with how much they run. But unlike rugby league or rugby union, even in the NFL, there's so many blocks of hypertrophy to put on this size because you need it.
Right.
Our boys quite the opposite. We use hypertrophy as an add-on to their program, not as a training block. So if we're in a training block and it might be an intensification block, we will have volume added on to those boys that need it, as opposed to doing a hypertrophy block, then coming into some sort of max strength block.
Right.
So I hope that makes sense. But
Yeah.
I think the biggest keys for our individualisation are based off, age group, 1. So 1 to 3 years are going to be the biggest difference. But then it's based off our heights, because we have such varying heights, and then based off their body weight, because we need to know, are we going to put on mass on this guy and he doesn't need it, or does he need it and we need to put on some mass while he's also running 45, 50 kilometres a week. So
yeah, I think just to kind of go a little bit deeper on that would be, when you have that 43, I mean, are you getting, how are you running your groups through the day? Are they coming off the practice field, all 43s coming in at the same time, and you're just divvying them up into groups based off those variables?
So the joys of AFL is they're full-time. In season and most of pre-season, we're not limited by times in the gym or times at the club, except for obviously the players' attention spans. So we obviously don't want to keep them there too long. But they will commonly come in, they'll do their on-field session in the morning. Pre-season, that can go upwards of 2 hours. In season, it'll be much shorter. Obviously, they're recovering a lot from their games. We play weekly. So they'll have maybe a 45, maybe a 65-minute session. But they'll have that that morning blockers on field. They'll have the opportunity in the middle of the day to have lunch, recover, reset. Then they come into their afternoon rotations. And with us, we usually set it up as a three-way rotation. So within our 43, we have roughly 16 in each group. That 16 will have a combination of a few things. They'll have weights in one of their 1 hour blocks. The other 2 hours worth may be robustness. So we call it robustness in reference to Pilates, lower limb work, all your low-level correctives.
Right.
So we've really endeavoured to make sure that when they come into the gym, they're there to get strong, they're there to get powerful.
Mm-hmm.
It's in, if you're in another setting, you might do some movement prep at the beginning, do some corrective work. You might have mobility work in there, low-level stuff. You might have your lower-level core work. We try and put that all into our robustness time. So in that robustness time, they're in a separate room. The energy level's much lower. It's much more peaceful. They go through real-time ultrasound for their inner unit work. They do Pilates. They do, if they've had a history of groin work, they'll do their groin correctives. If they've got hip stuff or knees, whatever it might be. So they get all that done there. So when they come into me in the gym, they are effectively getting prepped for the gym. They still got to get warm. So we do a little bar complex work, but then they're into it. And they lift, we go for heavy, we go for powerful stuff, and then they're out. We don't sort of tamper with that, let's do some lower level work, then jump into the power rack, then come back and stuff like that. So we've really endeavoured to make sure they know when they come to the gym, it's time to get powerful, it's time to get strong. With that rotation, they might have massage in there as well, they might have dietitian appointments, they might have coach reviews. But usually it's always done in a three-way rotation. So I'll only ever have 16 on the floor at once. But that is a range from first years all the way through to our old bulls.
Right.
So it's we don't bring in first years only, second years only, or anything like that. It's a complete mix.
You obviously you're dealing with an athlete that, like you said, I mean that runs so much, and for the most part are going to be at their playing weight. So if the focus is purely strength and power, like you said, when they come in the weight room, what are some of the best ways that you found to develop that strength and power? And maybe what are some of the tools that you're using? Are you using elite form or Tendo units or, to track velocity and power output, or are you just simply going off percentage-based training?
So we simple answer to that is in our early days we didn't use velocity-based training simply because our boys weren't strong enough. I quite frankly, I wasn't worried about bar velocity. I needed to teach them how to get strong. Our boys were more like a pendulum when it comes rugby versus soccer. Some boys love to lift and they'll go hard every session. Other boys, you've got to really coach them into lifting.
Right.
And that comes back to the nature of being a running sport. A lot of boys, that's their strong suit.
Yep.
So if your strong suit is running, you probably haven't lifted before. And when you do lift, you're probably not very good at it.
That's right.
It's a matter of trying to get these boys to understand that the reason we lift, and like you said, it's, you're looking to get stronger, looking to get powerful, because most of them, body weight wise, it will come. But another key thing we teach them and what we really chase is damage resistance, because our boys get so much damage on the field, whether it be getting hit, but more just running loads, just general muscle breakdown and soreness. So we are very big into our programs being based around that damage resistance. One aspect is that eccentric hamstring load. So we're very big in our eccentric hamstring work and that isolated hamstring work, because it's our number one injury in the AFL, hamstrings, like it is in quite a few sports.
Sure.
But if our boys do their hamstring, that costs us a lot.
Right.
So as Patrick Ward likes to say, the best availability or best ability is availability. So for us, it's very much about getting that damage resistance, making sure their hamstrings are really strong, but that ties in with their whole structure of their body, making sure everything can tolerate the loads that they're going to get put through by the coaches. But we weren't tracking a lot of velocity. It was about strength. It was about chasing real loads. We've gotten much more into some velocity work now that we've been doing. We use gym aware. We are looking at, into the push band side of things, whether we go down the route of getting more gym aware work or we go down the route of getting more push band stuff. But at the end of the day, a lot of our boys, like I said, it's about getting strong, and we use a percentage-based system with their load prescription. But what we've developed is working around a threshold. So the reason we decided to work this threshold is simply because a player of a 43-man squad, at the moment we may have 15 players that I could tell you every week they'll play in the ones.
Right.
I then have another maybe 6 or 7 players that they could play ones. They may play twos. They're on the fringe. Our boys are young. We don't know if they're going to come up ready enough for the ones. They might play twos.
Right.
Now, our twos play every weekend as well, but they will play at a different place. They'll play a different team, and by nature, their intensity and their output is lower because it's a less demanding game.
Sure.
So when we program intensity spikes or drops, there is no way of me knowing 4 weeks out if I'm programming for a player that's a ones player dropping to the twos or a twos player going up to the ones. So if you're a twos player going up to the ones and the following week I've programmed your most intense week, you are going to absolutely murder me. There's no way you're going to be able to pull that intensity.
Right.
Vice versa, if you're a ones player that drops to the twos the following week, and if I've programmed a down week, you'll be sitting there going, Coach, I can do more. Give me more. So I always program for those, whatever block it might be, a 4 or 5 week block. If it's a 4 week block, we will maintain the intensity for that 4 week block and we will manipulate the volume. And what we do by that is that volume, as an assumption, let's say it might be a total of 20 sets within the session. We will strip sets out depending on how the players are called up and depending on whether they played ones or twos. So what I mean by that is sometimes I'll have a 6-day break, sometimes I'll have a 7-day break. If we're lucky, they get an 8-day break. Mm-hmm. So in a 6-day break, like we've just had, we stripped out volume. They maintained intensity, but we stripped out volume. Next week, they'll roll into a 7-day break, so we'll add in a little bit more volume.
Right.
But the intensity part of it is, like I mentioned before, is a threshold. So they'll be set a target for that block. So if it's a bench press, they might be set 130 kilos as their target. Not necessarily a PB or anything. It'll depend on in season, out of season. But we will decide what percentage of their 1RM that target will be. And then we will use a threshold-based area where they will have a low threshold. So at 130 kilos, depending on the player's history, depending on whether they're first year through to 7th year, their low threshold might be 110. So that 130 is their target, that 110 is their low threshold.
Right.
So they will choose what they lift between those targets. So they'll come in and go, I got absolutely beaten up on the weekend. I got absolutely beaten up. I couldn't predict it. No one could predict it. So they come in and they go, Coach, I just lift my low threshold, 110. That's fine. The next week they come in, they're feeling fresh, so they might chase their target. So they know that within that 4-week block that they need to get their target at some stage, but I'm more than happy for them to select within that intensity range. So we definitely take the philosophy of building a framework, but then they select where they sit within that framework. And I think the buy-in that we've had from our boys has been fantastic, especially boys that their natural inkling is not to lift.
Right.
So they come in and they know that if they feel bad, I can go low threshold. But then when they're feeling good and they see other boys chasing targets, they chase targets.
Right.
So it's been a really good buy-in for us, and it allows us to prescribe intensities, but the ability for the players to self-select within that bracket because of what they've done on the weekend, how they've pulled up, whether they're injured, sore, tight, whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's great. It actually leads me into my next question with, with a program that's a startup program that you've been there from the get-go and creating a culture and an environment where they want to chase those targets and, they want to improve in an area that it's not as natural for them. What have been some of the things that you've done to kind of create that environment to where they're not wanting to stay at that low threshold every week just because they're not, they don't want to train? Obviously, it's a professional sport, so that if they don't want to do it long enough, they won't be there. But but even still, you got to create this environment where they want to improve.
Definitely. It's no hiding the fact it's very challenging early days because in our first year, we were effectively the highest paid under-20s team in the competition. So we had very little senior players. Our leadership group at the time were in their 2021. So they were not exposed to that environment of walking into a fully fledged club, seeing a 29-year-old superstar lifting heavy.
Right.
They don't see that. So every couple of months, it was almost like we broke through a glass ceiling because when we're lifting, first player to bench 100, suddenly 8 more players bench 100 in that next 2 weeks.
Right.
So I definitely did find it very challenging early days because we didn't have those senior players. We just did not have senior players that were lifting heavy and showing boys, look, you can squat X amount and still perform exceptionally well In fact, it helps you.
Right.
They went from, I'm DOMS, I'm DOMSy, I'm DOMSy. And like everyone knows, if you're not pushing that envelope, if you're sitting in that bracket where you're not quite evolving, but you're still causing muscle damage, everything you do is going to make you DOMSy.
Right.
So it's very much about, you've actually got to push yourself to adapt so you're not getting DOMSy. So it did take a while for boys to learn that, but organically they actually learned it within the gym when boys were PBing, and then other boys were chasing those PBs. So we based a lot of our stuff around, like a lot of people do, leaderboards, making sure regular updates, making sure they can see what they've been lifting, where they're going, having specific targets for specific lifts made their ability to chase them much better. From that, I think it was also an evolution of giving the opportunity to them to get strong. So as we've gotten older, they get to a stage where they may lift 3 times a week, or their opportunity was 3 times a week of lifting. So you and me both know how strong can you really get when you're running 50 kilometres in a week, and you've only got 3 50-minute sessions to lift. There's a limiting factor of how strong you're going to be able to get.
No question.
So we really endeavoured this season especially to give them more opportunities to lift. So we found in the schedule, can we do 2 sessions of lifting a day? Can we add another one here? Can we get 5 sessions in total for these boys that we know they need to get strong? And usually the boys that have sort of reached their plateau, but they're not quite where we want them. So we had a really large success rate this year of just adding more sessions in where we could find it, and making sure that we just chased. And one of those big ones was not getting too cute with the amount of things we put into a session. When you're limited with number of sessions, you get stuck into this realm of, I need to make sure I attack this. We need to get knee dominant work in. We need to get hip dominant work in, whatever it might be. So we endeavored to try and separate a couple of these sessions. So one of the sessions was just, that was our squat day. Boom, come in, 40, 45 minutes. All you need to think about is getting stronger on this squat. We might have had anywhere between 5 to 7 sets in it. Now, for an AFL player, that's a lot of sets. They're not used to that type of set range. And then they might have a little bit of a volume work at the end. But to have that primary focus, and they know what they need to do, I found made our strength gains much better. When they had quite a few things in the program, they definitely made gains, and some players responded really well. But I think we definitely didn't have that focus that we could have now that we've evolved and had a few more sessions, and can actually have one of those sessions or 2 of those sessions and just have a single focus. All the boys get around and say, right, all we need to do is hit this target for squatting. Let's build up. Let's get there. And it's much simpler than trying to know, let's do that target, but then you've got another 3 exercises or 4 exercises after that. You know what I mean? So one of the key things that we do now is we have our targets, we have leaderboards, we have each block, we have which boys hit the most targets, and we put that up. And then on top of that, we have our focuses. So we just select a couple of key lifts that they're going to focus on for that block, and that's what they chase. And then the next block, we might change the key lifts around a little bit, but they're like kids, mate. You've got to have a focus. They need to have their attention on one thing, and they'll improve. When their attention gets spread too much, I think they start to drop off.
Well, they're ultimately what makes them great and why they're professional athletes is because their competitiveness is what drives them. And so by having those leaderboards and having that, placing that goal and that target out in front of them, typically they'll do it. And especially, the one benefit, I mean, probably there was times when you were wanting to beat your head against the wall by dealing with a bunch of young kids, but the one benefit to that is that you have a bunch of resilient young kids that could go after it.
Yeah, well, to give you an idea, we had 2 years ago, we had 26 21st birthdays, and that is in a senior competition, a professional senior competition. So, mate, there's been little things that you never thought as a strength coach you deal with when these 18-year-old kids come in, and it's just like, some kids we used to do house raids to check, what their houses look like, and we found some players that thankfully aren't with us now, but we found chocolate bars under their beds and hidden and stuff like that. It's phenomenal, mate. I'm sure in a college setting you'd probably get some similar stories, but it's
daily in Rikers.
Exactly right.
Well, good, man. Well, hey, man, it's been fun. There's we could go on and on, I'm sure, but I know you got to get on with your day. Give us. We end the show with some resources here. Give us the best piece of coaching advice you ever received.
Best piece of coaching advice, I think. Joycey often says, be in a hurry to be great, not necessarily successful. So I think I've taken that on board quite a bit because it's especially in our industry and everything, you see people that are successful, obviously, because that's why they get exposed. But with social media these days, you can get people that appear to be successful that aren't quite as successful as you think.
No question.
And I think at the end of the day, you focus on your job, you focus on being great at what you do, everything else will come. And I think that's one of the best coaching advice, especially for young coaches out there that are in a hurry to be there. Don't be in a hurry to be successful, just be in a hurry to be great, I reckon.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. That definitely is a great piece of advice right there. What about a book, app, and website recommendation?
So book, I think most people have got every strength edition book under the sun these days. So I'm a massive fan of book The Legacy by James Kerr. So that's a book on the New Zealand All Blacks, and it's the stuff that people don't talk about. What makes a team great, and I think there's a lot of takeaways in that one. Mm-hmm. App, I think a lot of people miss out on the Dartfish app because it's Dartfish by nature is quite expensive if you get the software, but the app I think is only a few dollars, so it's very affordable. Yeah. But I use that on the iPad quite a lot, especially for our younger boys, just giving them simple feedback. And I think visual feedback's one of the best you can do. So absolutely. That would be one. Website. Geez, to be honest, I probably couldn't name one. I think I use a whole range of it from all podcast websites that we look at for all the show notes, but also Eric Cressy, Mike Boyle, all those type of things. But then along the lines of all your PubMed and all your research-based ones. So I probably couldn't isolate just one website.
Anymore you get stuff through your aggregators like Facebook and Twitter and all that.
Well, if you had to pick number one, probably Twitter. Yeah, I think you get a good range from that. You get your practical in the trench people, but then you also get your research that comes out as well. So no, definitely.
I agree with you, man. Well, bro, this has been fun, man. I'm excited to get down there and catch up with you down in Australia later this year as well. And obviously doing big things.
The AIS-AFL conference. It's going to be good.
Yeah, no, it's going to be awesome. I'm really, really excited about that one and get a chance to catch up with a bunch of friends on the other side of the world and talk shop, see it a different way. And that's ultimately what it's all about, right? It's getting a chance to talk. What's great about, being able to Skype somebody, half a world away and get a little bit better and do it on a Wednesday or whatever. It's awesome, man. So I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing with everybody, and thanks so much, bud.
No worries, mate. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Hopefully people get something out of it.
Absolutely.
That's it for this episode of Iron Game Chalk Talk. Thanks to this week's guest as well as our sponsors for bringing this episode to you for free. Make sure to check out ronmckeefery.com where you can join our mailing list, find the show notes, including all the links and resources mentioned, and information about Coach McKeefery's other products. While you are there, please join Coach McKeefery in the comments section thanking our guest for sharing. If you haven't subscribed to Iron Game Chalk Talk on YouTube or iTunes yet, make sure to do so. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome. Coach McKeefery can be found on Twitter at @RMcKeefery, on Facebook and YouTube at /Ron.McKeefery. That's it for this week. Be sure to check back next week for another great episode of Iron Game Chalk Talk.